When you plug your laptop into an input and then select it from a touch panel, how do you know which input to select? Well, this is where video presence detection comes in. Let's start with the panel design. Adding a button to the panel is done by using the Draw tool, and by default this is set as a general button that has two states, an on state and an off state. I can quickly view the two states by turning on the State Manager. To turn this into a multi-state button, I just need to change the button type to multi-state general and then change the state count. In this case, I need 3 states. Now if we look at the example I've already created, I've added some simple colors and text. The first state is what I want the user to see when there's nothing connected to the input. State 2 is a distinct change to differentiate it from the no connection state, and the third state shows that the input is now in presenting mode. On the Programming tab, I've set both the channel and the address code to 1. As with any button, the channel code is used to recognize when a button is pushed, and the address code is needed to send information to the button, in this case the button's state. If I was to simply turn the channel on the way we'd normally control button feedback, it would switch through all the button states, stopping at the last one. Here's a quick flow I've put together to demonstrate this. The first example is just turning the channel on and off by sending commands directly to the button using a UI feedback node set to deliver the payload. If we take a look at a VNC connection to the panel, you can see that the button switches quickly through each of the states, so this method of controlling feedback isn't really suitable. In my other example, I'm sending the specific button states rather than turning the button on or off. Using this method, I can set the button into each of the individual states depending on what I need the user to see. If you're using an earlier version of Automator, the process is slightly different. The true-false messages need to be sent to the button channel number, and changing the button state is done by sending the entire command to the panel. So now we know how to control the button, I need to check for video presence on the input, so I can use this to define the different button states. I'm using SVSI encoders and decoders on this project, and I can use an event node to monitor the input port for any changes. In other words, when the cable's plugged in or unplugged. I can also use a status node to get the current state, whether this has changed or not. I'm going to use both in this example. My encoders and decoders are already connected to the MUSE processor, so when I add an event node, I just choose the unit I'm monitoring, and the events list shows everything that I can monitor using its native H-Control API. The event I'm interested in is in the System Status section. By monitoring HDMI 1 cable status changed, I'm going to see an event each time the cable's plugged in or removed. If you're not sure what's going to be returned, use a debug node to check this. In this case, I know it's going to be a 1 or a 0. Now I can use a switch node with 2 outputs to determine the button state. At this point, I need 2 things to happen. The first is to switch the button to its connected state, and this is done using a UI feedback node. With the latest version of Automator, the button state can be controlled directly from this node. Simply select the panel followed by the button, and then the state it needs to change to. In this case, the second state is my connected state. If you're using an earlier version that doesn't have this function, you'll need to use the UI feedback node to send the entire command. *ani is the custom command we need, followed by the button address and then the button state. Using this command, you can animate through multiple different button states, but in this case, I just need to change to the state, so I'll enter the same button state twice. The 0 at the end is the time taken to animate. The second thing I need to do is to store this button state so I can refer to it at other points in the flow. This is done by using a change node and setting a new variable that I'm going to call global.hdmi1 to the value connected. To make things a little quicker, I'm going to copy and paste these nodes and change them to represent all the different button and connection states that I'm going to be using in this flow. I've used a global message rather than a flow message because I want this to be available from any tab in the project, not just the flows on this page. For my second output, which triggers when the response from the event node is 0, I can copy and paste the state 1 and disconnected nodes. With the input now being monitored, we can add a UI control node to monitor the button. Remember to leave the feedback set to none, as this is being managed separately. In order to toggle the function of the button, I'll use a switch node, but rather than monitoring the incoming message.payload, I want to check the property of global.hdmi1. If this is set to connected, I can switch the button to its third state and global HDMI 1 to presenting using the nodes I created earlier. If global.hdmi 1 is set to presenting, however, I need to toggle the button back to its second state and set the global variable back to connected. After these nodes, I can add command nodes to control the decoder's incoming stream. I haven't included a switch option for the disconnected state because if the HDMI cable is disconnected, I don't want the button to do anything at all. It's worth noting that the event node is only looking for a change in the HDMI state. If we need to keep everything synchronized when we restart the flows or if the panel restarts, there's an additional flow we can use. First of all, I'll add an inject node to poll the HDMI status. This needs to be set to trigger when the flow starts and then to repeat every few seconds. This is going to trigger a status node to check whether the cable is connected or not. Again, select the encoder being monitored followed by the system status drop-down, but this time I'm interested in HDMI 1's current status. The response from this function will either be connected or disconnected rather than a 1 or a 0, so I can use these in a switch node which checks the value of global.hdmi 1. If the cable is disconnected, I can just set the button back to state 1 and global.hdmi 1 to disconnected. If the cable is connected, however, I need another switch node to check if it's currently in presentation mode. To do this, I use not equal to as the value rule and then presenting as the value itself. If the value is currently set to presenting, the message goes no further and the button state stays the same. Providing the input is not currently presenting, the button and global.hdmi 1 can be set back to the connected state. So let's give this a try. I've added some debug nodes into the flow so you can see what's happening. My laptop is currently not plugged in, so there's no response from the button. As soon as I connect the cable, however, the button changes to reflect this and then works with a standard toggle function. If I unplug the cable, the button switches back to the disconnected state.